I did not go through her phone. I did not check her email. I did not follow her or ask her friends questions or go looking for something I was not sure I wanted to find. What I did notice was 3 of my tools were missing from the garage: a cordless drill, a level, and a socket set I had owned since before we got married. I asked her about it, and she said she had no idea. That same week, my neighbor caught me in the driveway and mentioned something he had been sitting on for a while. He said he had seen a couple of different guys coming and going from the house on separate occasions while I was at work. Not once, separate occasions. He said he figured it was none of his business, but thought I should know. I thanked him, went inside, and did not say a single word to her about it. My father was a detective for 21 years. The first thing he ever taught me about suspicion was this: never make an accusation without proof. The second thing he taught me was how to get it. The next morning, I called a private investigator. 14 years on the job teaches you one thing above everything else: patience. You do not rush into a burning building without reading the smoke first. You assess, you plan, you move when you know what you are walking into. I applied that same thinking the morning after my neighbor told me what he had seen. I am a firefighter in Michigan, 24-hour rotations, in before sunrise, back the following morning. My wife knew that schedule. 12 years of marriage means 12 years of knowing exactly when the house was empty and exactly how long it would stay that way. We had sold our house 8 months earlier and moved into a rental while we figured out our next move. No kids, no mortgage holding us anywhere. I used to think that was the cleanest version of a fresh start. The private investigator I found had a reputation in the trades: word of mouth, no website, the kind of person you only hear about when someone you trust has already used him. I reached out through a contact, got his number, and called him from my car on the way home from a shift. We met once before he started working. I gave him the neighbor's account, the missing tools, the dates I had been on rotation, and told him I needed to know what was happening in that house while I was gone. He told me he would be in touch once he had something. He came back to me in 22 days. We met at a bar 2 towns over, and he put a folder on the table without saying anything first. I opened it. 3 men, documented across 22 days, each one photographed leaving my home on days I was on shift. Not one man living a double life. 3 separate men, 3 separate patterns, each one rotating through that house on a different day, like they had their own arrangement with the schedule I had built around keeping my family stable. The private investigator had followed each one after they left. He ran their plates, pulled their vehicle registrations, and cross-referenced their names against public marriage records. All 3 of these men were married. He slid a second page across: names, home addresses, the names of their wives. I read every name on that page twice. I had spent 12 years working overnight shifts so that woman at one point live in a house I paid for, drive a car I helped to buy, and exist inside a life I had built from the ground up at 3 in the morning while other people slept. And she had spent some of those years I know handing pieces of that life to men who were not her husband. I closed the folder, paid for my drink, and drove home. She was inside when I pulled in. I walked through the door, ate dinner, and went to bed without saying a word. The next morning, I called an attorney. My father had used the same family law attorney during his own divorce 11 years earlier, and told me she was the only person he trusted with paperwork. I walked into her office with the private investigator's folder, the surveillance photographs, and 12 years of joint financial records on a flash drive. She went through everything page by page. When she finished, she set the folder down and said, "This is going to matter in front of a judge. Michigan requires fault to be considered as a statutory factor when determining spousal support. 3 documented affairs backed by a licensed private investigator's surveillance carries weight that is difficult to argue against." She told me the financial records showing 12 years of joint income gave her everything she needed to counter any alimony claim based on income disparity. Then she said something that reframed the entire conversation. She told me adultery is classified as a felony under Michigan law. Prosecution was super rare, but the classification meant the court was not going to treat this as a footnote. I told her about the 3 names, the 3 addresses, and the 3 wives who had no idea what their husbands had been doing. She did not tell me to mail anything. She did not tell me not to. She said, "Whatever you decide to do with that information needs to happen before we file, because once papers are served, everything is documented and on record." I told her to give me 48 hours. She handed me the filing paperwork to review and walked me to the door. I stopped at an office supply store on the way home and bought 3 manila envelopes. I spent those 48 hours thinking about 3 women I had never met. Not about my wife, about them. They were waking up every morning next to men who had been driving to my house on my shift days for months. They deserved to know. I spread everything out on the floor of the spare bedroom the first night and built 3 separate files, printed copies of the private investigator's photographs, the surveillance dates, the plate registration documents showing each man's name and home address. No notes, no explanations, just the evidence, clean and organized, 1 set per envelope. The second night, I addressed all 3 envelopes by hand and left them on the passenger seat of my car. She came home from work, made dinner, settled onto the couch, and talked about her week. I let her talk and did not intervene once. The next morning, I stopped at the post office on my way to the firehouse, paid cash, and mailed all 3 envelopes before 8 in the morning. Then I pulled into the firehouse lot, took out my phone, and blocked her number. Not after the confrontation. Not after the divorce was filed, before any of it, because I had nothing left to say to her, and everything I needed to say had already been sealed, stamped, and dropped into a mail slot by a man who had spent 12 years trusting the wrong person. I walked into the firehouse, started my shift, and did not think about her once for the next 24 hours. I came off shift the next morning and drove home. Her car was in the driveway. She met me at the door before I could get my key out. She asked me why her calls were going straight to voicemail. I told her I had blocked her number. She looked at me the way people look when they hear something that does not make sense yet. I walked past her, set my bag down, and told her to sit down because I had something to say, and I was only going to say it once. I told her about the neighbor, what he saw, when he saw it, how many separate occasions he had counted. The private investigator came next. 22 days of surveillance. 3 different men photographed leaving our home on days I was on shift. Plates ran, vehicle registrations pulled, public marriage records cross-referenced, all 3 of them married, all 3 with wives who had no idea. I told her the envelopes had already been mailed. She did not say anything. She looked like she was in a daze. Then she asked me if I had actually sent them. I told her they were already delivered. She asked me why I would do that. I told her that 3 women deserved to know what their husbands had been doing in my house while I was working overnight, so the bills got paid. She started crying. I told her the attorney had already been retained. The filing was ready, and the only question left was whether she wanted to handle this cleanly or make it difficult. She asked about spousal support. I told her Michigan requires a judge to consider fault when ruling on spousal support, and that a folder documenting 3 men across 3 weeks of surveillance was going in front of that judge, whether she contested it or not. She stopped crying. I picked up my bag, went to the bedroom, and slept for 6 hours. When I woke up and came out of the bedroom, she was gone. The divorce hearing was 8 weeks later. She showed up with an attorney who argued that 12 years of marriage and a significant income gap justified spousal support, regardless of the circumstances that ended it. My attorney put the private investigator's folder in front of the judge. 3 men documented across 3 weeks of surveillance. 3 sets of plate registrations cross-referenced against public marriage records. All of it legally obtained. All of it time-stamped. All of it documented by a licensed investigator whose methods would hold up to any challenge her attorney wanted to raise. Her attorney pivoted and argued that the affairs were isolated incidents that did not reflect a pattern of misconduct. My attorney set the folder down and let the judge count the photographs himself. The judge looked at the evidence, looked at her attorney, and said he had seen enough. Michigan law requires fault to be weighed as a statutory factor in spousal support determinations, and what was sitting on that table was not an isolated incident. It was a documented pattern that seemed to run the length of the marriage, or at least what the private investigator could prove. Spousal support denied. She walked out of that courtroom empty-handed. Not totally. She kept her car, her stuff, and a little bit of money. I signed the final paperwork 3 weeks later and called my father. He picked up on the second ring. I told him his advice had held up. He said, "It always does." We talked for 20 minutes and neither of us mentioned her once. First update. About 10 days after the envelopes went out, a woman knocked on my door on a morning I was home between shifts. I did not know her. She introduced herself by her first name and told me she had received a package in the mail and believed it had come from whoever lived at this address. I told her she had the right place. She had driven 40 minutes to get there. She did not sound angry. She sounded like someone who had spent 9 days trying to talk herself out of what was in that envelope and finally stopped trying. She told me her husband had denied everything when she confronted him, said the photographs were taken out of context, said he had a work reason for being at that address that he could not explain without breaching a client agreement, said whoever sent the package was trying to destroy their marriage. She told me she almost believed him. Then she matched the plate number in the photographs against his vehicle registration, and the numbers were identical down to the last digit. She looked at me and then asked, how long did I know all of this was going on? I told her 22 days of documentation was all I had, and that I had no way of knowing how long it had been going on before that. She said her husband had been traveling for work 2 or 3 times a month for the last 4 years, and she had never once questioned it. I did not say anything to that. She thanked me for sending the envelope. I told her I was sorry she was going through it. She said she was not sorry she knew, and that there was a difference between the two. She left, and I did not hear from her again until she sent me a text the morning she walked out of her attorney's office. She said it had been 11 days since she knocked on my door. She said, "Thank you for not staying quiet." I read it once, set my phone down, and went to work. The other 2 wives had the same documentation in their envelopes, the same photographs, the same plate registrations, the same address. Whether they knocked on a door or made a call or did nothing at all was their decision to make. I sent the truth. What people do with it is not mine to carry. Second update. 6 months after the hearing, the lease on the house came up for renewal. The lease had always been in my name alone. A firefighter's income and employment history made the application straightforward. Her income was inconsistent enough that the landlord had not put her on it. When she left after the divorce, she stopped contributing to the household expenses. I covered the remaining months, let the lease expire, and moved into a 1-bedroom closer to the firehouse. Smaller space, nothing in it that reminded me of 12 years I was done replaying. My father helped me move on a morning we both had free. He carried boxes without asking questions, and we ordered food from a place down the street when we were done. Before he left, he looked around the apartment and said, "This is a good room to start from." I told him I thought so too. The guys at the firehouse had known something was off for months. You cannot run 24-hour shifts alongside people and hide that kind of weight without them noticing. Nobody pushed me to talk about it. That is one of the things I respect most about the job. The people in it understand that some things get worked out in silence, and that silence is not the same as struggling. My father called me on a night I was off shift about 2 months later. He asked me how I was doing, the real version of the question, not the one people ask when they do not actually want the answer. I told him I was better than I had been in years. He said he knew. He could hear it. He said, "Your grandfather used to say that the worst thing that ever happened to a man is only the worst thing if he lets it stay that way." I wrote that down after we hung up. I have not needed to read it since. Third update. About 8 months after the divorce was final, I ran into one of the three men at a gas station. I did not place him at first. I had only seen him in surveillance photographs, and photographs taken from a distance in a parking lot do not prepare you for the real thing. He recognized me somehow. I could tell by the way he stopped moving when he saw my face, the way he looked at the ground and then back at me like he was calculating something. He walked over. I did not move toward him or away from him. He said he wanted to talk. I told him I had nothing to say to him. He said his wife had filed for divorce after receiving the envelope, and he wanted to know if I understood what I had done to his family. I told him I understood exactly what I had done. I told him I had sent his wife the same information he already had, the truth about where he had been spending his time. He said that was not my decision to make. I told him, actually, that was my decision. I made it, and I would make it again. He stood there for a moment, then got in his car and left. I finished filling my tank and drove to the firehouse. I thought about that conversation for about 2 hours before it stopped mattering. A man who spent months walking through someone else's front door does not get to be angry about the consequences of what he did in my house. He made his decision every single time he showed up. I made mine once with a stamp and 3 envelopes, and I never lost a night of sleep over it. Fourth update. About a year after the divorce was final, my neighbor stopped me in the driveway again. The same neighbor who had told me what he had seen, the same conversation that started all of it. He said he had been meaning to tell me something since before the divorce, but never found the right moment. He said one of the men he had seen coming and going from the house had come back once, about 2 weeks after the last time he had seen him, carrying what looked like a toolbox. Not his own toolbox, mine. He said the man had knocked on the door. My wife had let him in, and he had left 20 minutes later without the toolbox. I had never gotten those tools back. The cordless drill, the level, the socket set I had owned since before we got married. Somewhere out there, they were sitting in a garage that did not belong to me, left behind by a man who thought a married woman's house was somewhere he had the right to store things. I stood in the driveway for a moment after my neighbor finished talking. Then I told him I appreciated him telling me. He said he should have told me sooner. I told him what he had told me the first time was enough. The rest was just details. I never went looking for the tools. They were not worth what it would cost to care about them. Some things you leave behind not because they do not matter, but because going back for them costs more than moving forward without them. My father said something similar the last time we talked about any of it. He said, the evidence was always there. You just had to be patient enough to let it show itself. He was right. He usually was.